My name is Dan Smith. I'm director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and let me welcome you to this meeting we've convened together with the European Centre for Development Policy Management, Andrew, on the changing nature of support to peace building, which marks a moment of a process of launching the ECDPM report, which you've all got copies of because when you sat down, it was right there. Several meetings that you've been doing to launch this report out, and we're very pleased to be able to work with you to have this meeting. Very pleased that you could come, everybody, and of course we are joined by an online audience as well, because as usual we're live streaming. Together with me on the podium here is, first of all, Andrew Sheriff, who is the head of European External Affairs Programme at ECDPM, and who is has led the research project that you've done in order to produce this report, and is the lead author of it. Sitting to my left is Beverly Warmington, who's the director of Conflict, Humanitarian and Security Division in DFID in the UK. And further along, Johannes Oljulund, who's Director General for International Development in the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I have to say about Johannes that his presence is very precious. So precious that it will be foreshortened. And about 20 minutes before we end the discussion, Johannes will end, and I can guarantee that he will be replaced by an extremely competent replacement. But as yet, I'm not perfectly sure who that is. When that knowledge is vouchsafed to me, then I will be passing it on to you, and I know what the options are. It's not quite as disorganized or disorienting as it sounds. Don't worry, we'll handle it well. So what we're going to do is have Andrew present the report. This extremely impressive looking screen, because our photographs are on it, will be replaced by slides, I think, as we go through. And then we will have a discussion amongst the three of us, the four of us, and I would like to bring you into the conversation as well, because there is a great deal of knowledge I can see. I know several of you, and we've got a very well-informed and competent audience here. We were just talking, reminiscing, going back some 15 years to think about the trajectory of peace building. I was involved in writing a report that was published at the very end of 2003 about the need to have strategy in peace building. Part of the evidence base at that point was a database of some 350 or so projects of peace building during the previous 5 years. And of those, 54% did not mention strategy. They had no connection to either a strategy on the issue, or a strategy for the country, or the strategy of the agency or the government concerned. And that strategic deficit, as I called it at the time, was really quite striking. A couple of years later, and for reasons absolutely unconnected to the report that I had written for Western European governments, the Peacebuilding Commission and Peacebuilding Architecture was set up in the UN. I was surprised, pleased, delighted to be nominated by the UK government as a non-governmental organisation leader to be a member of the advisory group for the Peacebuilding Fund in the first couple of years. And it's generally 2 years and sometimes 4 years membership of the Peacebuilding Fund Advisory Group. So it's a rotating membership, and today Johannes is a member of that advisory group as well. So there's a continuity there also, in the way that the field has unfolded. As peace building has developed, as its practitioners have become more knowledgeable, as the understanding of what is involved in building peace has become more subtle, at the same time, over the past 10 years, both global economic conditions and global geopolitics have changed dramatically. So the question really is, in this new environment, where is peace building heading now, and where are the policies of the main supporters of peace building heading? Andrew, please tell us.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very nice being here in Stockholm today, and also at a forum with, in partnership with SIPRI, and also with two very experienced and lead governments in terms of supporting peace building on the panel. So I'm just going to take you through, the report is available on your chair. I'm going to whip through it very quickly, so there is more detail that I'm not going to talk about today that you can get from the report. But basically, in terms of, I'm just going to give you a quick background and then talk about what the factors that we've found have influenced European support to peace building. And I'm going to give you some concluding remarks and concluding reports. So basically, when the first question is, well, why are you doing a study on peace building right now? And I think, there's a number of issues. As a think tank working on European development policy and European foreign policy, it's pretty indisputable that we are in a time of significant global European change dynamics. And what we were hearing as a policy think tank was growing concern from all sorts of communities, whether it's human rights or development, and also peace building, of what do these changes mean for issues that we have worked very hard to keep on the policy agenda and move forward? And how do we respond to this? And also there's very limited policy analysis on actually what are the factors that drive change and how they might evolve at the moment. Basically, very quickly, we did qualitative and quantitative research. It's based on 4 case studies, the EU institutions, Germany, Sweden, and the UK. Together, these 4 give about 50% of the financial support to peace building, and the sticky fingers of these countries can be found over most international norm policy frameworks are related to peace building that you can find. So they are influential financially and also politically and in policy terms. What we looked at was really how things are, what really influences support, not how things should be. I think the peace building field often tries to recreate the world in how things should work, and that's not what we're trying to do with this report. So what is peace building? You can get 30 peace builders in a room and they'll argue about this for 3 days. I'm not going to go into it. It's soon going to be in the dictionary, but there are just some elements on the board about kind of things that what peace building or peace builders would recognize: long-term, all stages of conflict, multidimensional in that sense. You don't have to see what's on this diagram to say that we've basically been on a 30-year journey, or almost 30-year journey, in relation to policy frameworks, both those developed by Sweden, for example, in 1999, one of the first countries to have a specific framework on responding to violent conflict that was then copied and picked up by others. And Sweden was influential in driving that through the UN agenda at the time. Many people in the room probably know intimately the policies mentioned here because they were part of the backroom deals, and I know a few of you in the room were there in terms of trying to make things happen over the last 30 years. So it's not really a lack of policy that we have. The policies are there. The policies have been developed. There is always a way to nuance them and bring them to new issues. But essentially, we've had 30 years of policy. Yep, the trends in violent conflict, though, are not going in the right direction. And SIPRI has done plenty of work on that you can look at. And the peace building seems to be supported by a relatively small group of countries, European countries. So essentially, these are the top 10 donors to peace building in the last 10 years. Sweden ranks consistently at either a 6 or a 7 in that list, but it's not a long list, and the amounts given dramatically tail off. So basically the peace building community, financially at least globally, is really reliant on a relatively small number of actors. The resources have been growing though, 79%, 1.9 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, and it certainly is in some ways, but it's actually really 1% of global aid. So we're not talking about a great deal amount of resources. Basically, what we tried to figure out was what were the factors that actually influence governments' political, financial support to peace building? What are the things you can look at over the last 30 years and say, these are the things that influence whether countries support peace building or not, and the EU supports peace building? So basically the first thing is support to peace building at the bottom is what we're looking for. Well, no surprise, it's a political choice. Essentially, you can either support it or not support it. And it's also a bureaucratic choice. It's more on the how. Do you create new units? Do you create new funding mechanisms? Do you create new policies? Many of those are from political direction, but essentially support to peace building at its most simple is a political and bureaucratic choice. So what influences this? Well, these political and bureaucratic choices lead to your foreign policy priorities, your development policy priorities, other policies that may have a relevance for peace building, increasingly internal security issues, for example. And all this is framed within a bureaucratic system of governance. And while the MFA at Sweden would love to turn around and tell CEDA every day what to do, perhaps, they cannot do that because of the system of governance. The systems of governance are not a conspiracy against effective support to peace building, but they have a huge influence on how peace building is actually supported. And they are very resistant to change, and Sweden, Germany, the UK, and the EU are very different in terms of how their systems of governance play out, and that is the filter through which all support to peace building goes. The most important factor is the geopolitical era that you're in. The big drive for peace building came at the end of the Cold War, and you saw that that's where political space, neoliberal, liberal optimism about future liberal international order, and there was a lot of space and policy space created for peace building. We see three eras since the sort of end of the Cold War, the sort of one that ended really with September the 11th, and then one that sort of began to move around 2011 with Arab Spring, Syria, drawdown of troops from Iraq, in a sense through a much more interest-based geopolitical era. This is what sets the framework overall for foreign and development policy ministries' priorities. And so if we're shifting geopolitical era, you can pretty much say that the support to peace building will move. The second factor is domestic political culture. How come on that list of 10 countries you didn't see France? It's a Western liberal democratic country, has many similar characteristics to other Western European countries. How come Sweden, basically, peace building is something that transcends changes in governments, well, at least to date. It's because it relates to the national political culture and sense of place in the world. Germany, pacifist country coming out of the Second World War. UK, Security Council member, has a global vision. EU as a peace project itself, this domestic political culture, hugely important in setting the framework to support peace building and whether there is a permissive environment politically and bureaucratically to follow through on this. These are the two most dominant factors that lead to why peace building is supported and how, the political and bureaucratic choices. Very quickly, other things can impact it. Domestic events with an international dimension, the migration crisis, for example, or terrorist attacks in the UK, for example, had a huge impact. These, because they touch domestic politics at the top table, they can reset and push political priorities geographically and thematically in relation to foreign and development policy. Major conflicts and instability. The fact that Europe is now more surrounded by conflict is an important factor. In the past, things like Rwanda, Afghanistan and Iraq have really shaped responding not only to peace building in those countries, but also more globally for the countries that we looked at. What your allies do. The UK had a stabilization unit. The Germans went, oh, we think we might want one of those ourselves. And the EU said, we want one of those too. Why? Because there's a lot of mimicry between like-minded countries and sort of picking up ideas. What your allies do, or those that you feel particularly close to and like-minded with, you're likely to pick up ideas and perspectives from them and try and build them into your own policies in relation to peace building. International norms and commitments. In Sweden, I'm sure you'd love to have this at the top. So your Sustainable Development Goals 16, the Sustaining Peace Agenda. You know, these should be the things that should frame our foreign development policy and hopefully foreign development policies in the world. We didn't find that. We found them quite far down the list of things that actually influence. And then conflict-related expertise, for which there's a lot in the room. This has been hugely influential in terms of support to peace building, but very much on a particular area, which is really the conflict-related policy and the guidance, and not in setting the overall foreign policy, development policy priorities, or in influencing the top-level political choices. It's really, and in a way, we would contend that given the changing politics you have now, actually it's a law of diminishing returns. Not to say that expertise isn't important, but as the politics change at the overall level, expertise is not enough to move things in relation to support to peace building. So those are the 8 factors. Beyond that, some very quick concluding thoughts. So basically, it's a resilient idea, peace building. It's been around for 30 years. I don't think it's going anywhere, but it hasn't really transformed foreign and development policies, even in relation to violent conflicts. There are a bunch of other ideas and perspectives in responding to violent conflict other than peace building. The quality of support to peace building is in flux. The money is greater than it's ever been before, but the consistent complaints is that it is the quality of the money and the quality of the political support and the drive for political support is being influenced. Geopolitical era is changing in domestic politics, in all our case studies are driving that change. And things are evolving at a faster and more significant rate than they have been in the last 30 years. So what can we say? What does that mean for the future? I think I'll just finish with the 2 points at the end, that basically what is the space and allies for normative agendas such as peace building in the current geopolitical, European political, and domestic political environment? I think there's a question mark there, given the evolutions we're seeing on all those levels. And maybe a more potentially upbeat one, is the current situation a threat or an opportunity? I think a lot of people are galvanizing to try and support and engage and ensure these normative agendas like peace building are not lost. There's even those from the South who say, well, actually having Western countries not so dominant in setting the agenda for peace building and funding it may not naturally be a bad thing, and we may have a more democratic approach to supporting peace and responding to the situations. Yet, I think there are some big players on the global scene where you have to ask, who are increasingly setting the agenda, do they subscribe to peace-building ideals of long-term multi-stakeholder civil society engaging at all stages of conflict in the same way that the norms that were set out in the policy documents originally were? So thank you very much. There's more in the report, and I'm happy to engage in the conversation.
Gosh, I think it's done.
So we'll resettle ourselves, and Andrew, thank you very much. At high speed, that was excellent. And people who are able to read while they think, while they listen, can also have a look at the executive summary as we go through the conversation. One of the things I'm struck by, and I want to press you on this a little before turning to Beverly and Johannes. In 2003, when I wrote the report which I mentioned before, which was for the 4 governments, UK and Germany, of course, and then also Norway and the Netherlands. Actually, even though that was a couple of years after 9/11, I think that looking ahead, at that point, there was quite a lot of confidence. Mm-hmm. Right? So when we had the launch meeting for it, people were talking about how do we do peace building? Right? How do we make this field stronger? How do we have more effect in the conflicts that are going to be coming to an end, and to build on the peace achievements that have been made? And I don't think we had that sense of uncertainty at that time, which we pick up from your 2 concluding questions there, where, in my notes, I really just wrote, future, big question mark. So you posed it as questions, but did you pick up during the course of your research, during discussions with interlocutors in the 3 governments and in the EU or elsewhere, some sense that offers some kind of signposts for going into the fog of the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, this is, after all, also the era of the SDGs. It's the era of SDG 16. It's Agenda 2030. There's timetables, there's targets, there's ambitions. Did you feel those affecting and shaping the discussion, or is it really just uncertainty that you've picked up?
I think it's a very different political mood that I picked up and that we picked up in our research, and I think a much more concern for self-interest in foreign policy and development policy, a lot less optimism about international norms and frameworks. I mean, I've had discussions in foreign ministries talking about priorities for 30 minutes on development, well, not 30 minutes, 2 hours on development cooperation, where the SDGs don't even come up. it's about migration, it's about security on your borders. So I think that the political moment has definitely changed. I also, to go back to what you said, Dan, I think, in a way, and this is a bit heretical to say in the peacebuilding community, September the 11th also provided a great impetus that security was on the development agenda more. And so actually the peacebuilding community took that momentum and steered it towards a particular agenda, but took the momentum there and was seeing it, can we use that? And the funds came, the norms were developed then. I see now why you still have things like the Sustaining Peace Agenda and you have SDG 16, much more concerned that self-interest must be satisfied, domestic politics must be satisfied. This is no longer an agenda that is foreign ministries, this is heads of government and political parties who are setting the agenda more. So, and officials who we deal with who don't usually have to respond to domestic constituencies or the top level of politics, feeling that very pressing on the decisions that they were making that would have an impact on peace building.
So that's the view from, as seen from an independent think tank outside of government. And now we have two people who are in key positions within government who are either going to tell us that those pressures don't exist or explain in some way where they see the room for maneuver and what kind of signposts or guidance you see actually there helping your work, or maybe even sometimes hindering it, but helping shape your work as we go into this, the next 5 to 10 years of peace building.
Well, thank you very much. The case study on Sweden is very clear on saying that this is that the engagement is coming from a more sort of ethical or from that perspective, and I fundamentally I think that's right. That's the way I perceive it. The engagement. Now I'm coming, of course, from the development side, which is in many ways. There's been political agreement for a very long time that we are, we're doing this to fight poverty and so on. It's a very sort of, in a way, a very altruistic starting point, mm-hmm. And there might be different perceptions in other places. But I still think that fundamentally, you also, even this can be put in a sort of, security policy context. Of course, we are a small country, keen on multilateralism, keen on global cooperation and so on. Not purely from an altruistic point of view, but also because that is in our interest. That's also true. So we are supporting this. We don't want a situation where potential conflicts in our own area are dealt with bilaterally between smaller and bigger countries, if I can say that. And I think that's I'm not saying it's missing in your report, but I think that has to be remembered. Perhaps in the daily work at times that's not how we put it, how we explain it, and that's reasonable. But I think that at the core that also exists. If we do see the pressures, absolutely we do. I think that we have been, particularly on migration, it's been a very difficult discussion. I also think you'll tell me your perspective, but I think that in at least big parts of the development community, you'll find that if what you want to address is migration or migration pressures, so then you come back to the root causes. So the end result is the same. So what do we do? How do we tackle this? Peace building and the efforts that we are engaging in will be what they are, regardless of what sort of the motif for that is. I would say that in our case we have not changed the motif, but we are willing to talk about root causes, and we are. You also make this clear in your case study on Sweden that Swedish migration policies have also changed. It was a dramatic year in 2015, and it didn't pass unnoticed, and it led to changes in politics as well. But yes, we do see this, and it does have influence on what we do, or on what we do on a European level and global level. But I think that we, and perhaps that's the sort of technical perspective of this, our engagement being built on long-term strategies and so on. Then you will see that kind of response that, okay, we have migration pressure, what do? Well, we do more of the same, or more of, this is still the avenue to engage.
Do you feel that there is the kind of traction that you would hope for, that you would like to see actually in the policies? I mean, I'll explain the reason for my question. I sense that since the war in Syria started, that there has become more skepticism, maybe some kind of almost hopelessness would be too strong, but certainly declining optimism and confidence about the ability of the peaceful orientation, the peaceful inclinations of international donors, whether through peace building or other devices, to have an effect. And if I compare that, not necessarily to the reality of the first decade of this century as it unfolded, but again, going back to what people in the field seemed to feel in the early 2000s, despite Afghanistan, despite 9/11, despite Iraq, there was a kind of confidence that this stuff was going to work. If we get it right, it will be working. Where do you feel that stands now? I mean, if you're trying to address the root causes of migration in poorly governed, climate change impacted, conflict-torn countries, you're going after a big target. We all know that. So how does it, what kind of policy traction in the real world do you feel that is available?
I didn't suggest that we were going to solve it. I was just saying that we're trying to address it.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a difference. I think that if we look at, from a Swedish perspective, if we look at Syria as an example, and of course a very prominent example, then of course realistically, in a sense, we have to, our response will have it, we'll have to sort of compartmentalize that in a sense that, where is the space that we can act in the humanitarian field, for example, but at the core and fundamentals of that conflict, our clout, our possibilities to influence is what it is. It's limited. We do try and play our role in the Security Council and so on, but we can, there are parts where we can be active. And I think that peace building, we'll see what possibilities there are in the coming years. But at the current time, of course, the influence that we can have is limited, and possibly, a conflict such as Syria, which is close to, in many ways close to home, and relates or has direct influences on our society. Yes, that can lead to sort of a sense of not having the possibilities to influence. I agree with that.
Beverly, where do you, going back again, Andrew was giving the perspective from the independent think tank. How do you look at these issues from your standpoint within government?
Thanks very much. Sorry, it's a bit loud. I don't know if I need to be that loud. First of all, I just wanted to say that this is, I'll be talking quite personally, so if we could have Chatham House rules, because as a civil servant, it would be really nice if I could be... being live streamed, so okay, I will be open as much as I can, but just saying I'm being as open as I can here. First of all, on the political choice and bureaucratic choice, I think that all of our development work is bureaucratic and political. That's the nature of being civil servants. Your ministers take political decisions, you give bureaucratic advice. So I think that you could say that about everything that we do, really. And on the geopolitical issue, the world has changed massively, but a lot of that is about us needing to fund different areas, if that makes sense. So I think that the opportunity to fund has increased with the geopolitical changes. There have been huge shifts, let's face it, in the world order and in respecting the norms. The UK is a huge advocate for the world order and the norms, and we will continue to be as we exit EU. So I think that that's something that the UK is very, very keen to progress on. I thought it was interesting what you said about different countries, and I was saying to some others, it's very interesting to read a report about yourselves. It's a bit like 360 feedback. Well, this is what people think of Brits, is it? It's kind of... but when you made the point about other European countries not funding, I see what you mean about the fact that there are some of us that do and some of us that don't, and that is domestic political decisions, obviously. I think on the big, on where are we going, well, we are responding to the geopolitical issues. I mean, I'll talk later about DFID specifically, but in the same way as middle-income countries are powering their way out of poverty and their requests of us are now very different, and we need a different offer in some of those lower middle-income countries like Zambia and Ghana, in the same way, if our analysis by 2030 is that 80% of the world's poor will live in fragile states, we need a different offer in fragile states. If development is going to be around fragility, then obviously fragility is going to be the main part of our development offer. And that is something that we need to think very closely about in DFID, and we are considering what our response to that will be, and how we change and how peace building becomes an important part of that work, and how security and justice and those kind of building of institutions is something that DFID needs to think about. So I'll talk a bit more about that later. But I do think that if extreme poverty is becoming more fragile and more African, then it will have a big impact. And that's the geopolitical impact on what we do, the fact that the world's changing and we need to respond to that and how we respond. I think, yes, we didn't see the Arab Spring, Libya, Syria coming, and how we respond to that and how we have responded to that has been a big shift. We've done quite a lot of work on migration and around the compacts. So I think there has been a big change in how we do that. On the big donors, it's clear to me, and we have talked about this, that the big donors on peacebuilding need to come together better. Mm-hmm. We don't coalesce together the way we used to do about 20 years ago, and we need to think through how we work together, do joint programming, have a look at a big portfolio of work together and look at where our niches might be and where we come into that. And it's something that we're keen to do with Sweden and Germany and the big donors, the US and the EU. So I think we do need to do a bit more about that. The other thing I want to say about this is high risk. This is really high risk work. And for politicians, you need to be able to be very explicit about how risky it is and how you'll mitigate those risks. But it is something I think that it should run through everything with what we do about the risk around it. You talked a bit about in the national interest, and some saw it as an opportunity. I think we saw it as an opportunity in the UK to drive development through what the rest of the British government did. So it's mentioned in our security defence review, it's national security capability review. Development is now mentioned throughout. There is language saying the strategic defence security review said it is firmly in our national interest to tackle the causes and to mitigate the effects of conflict. So we see it as a way of driving it through the rest of government to try and get them on board. And we will engage with the rest of government on where we can add value and where what DFID does on development can add value to the bigger picture. But we're very clear that we come with a different offer to them and that we will tailor that to make sure we are working together, but it will be different in what we do. And I think that is respected by other government departments. Thank you.
Yeah, Johannes, so there's... Well, there are going to be the case studies published, and one which has been published and is on people's chairs is the Sweden case study. Have you had a chance to have a look at that? And if so, how do you respond to it? And then I'll ask Andrew to respond to your response.
Yes, I have had a chance to look at it. Thank you very much. It's, as you say, it's interesting to read about your own country and see if it sort of fits with your own perceptions of the way things are. And I think, I mean, I do share the perspectives that I said a little bit earlier on sort of, in a way, the starting points for where we are coming from in this field, which is also seems to stick over governments. Chatham House, I hardly have a government, so challenging.
How nice!
I took particular interest in reading on what you said on the governance structure and how we are structured, which I think you mentioned risk. I think that this has, to a level, it has produced perhaps more willingness to take a risk. The fact that we have the governance structure that we do, where the government gives directives and takes strategies, but gives quite a lot of space for independent agencies, which is also that gives room for some opportunities. You also point at the need for connecting this to a stronger political engagement, which I think at least in the last couple of years we've seen that, and coming out from our membership or temporary membership in the Security Council, which has given us a platform and of course both a necessity and an opportunity to engage more in the political level discussion. Also on the development side with my development minister's involvement in the international dialogue, and so yeah, no real complaints about your report. I noted the financing part of it ends in 2016. So look at because it looks good 2017 and 2018.
I was going to say actually, when you were asked whether we think it will work, the amount of money that we're putting to this, I think, reflects the fact that we think it will. Yeah. You asked about optimism. I don't think if we thought it wouldn't work, we wouldn't be funding to the levels we are.
Perhaps another comment in a way is, if you look at the sort of the funding crowd, or the people, the group involved in this, and now I can't remember exactly the list, but if adding perhaps Japan, South Korea, it would be true for quite a lot of other sectors as well. If you look at climate finance or other finance, I mean, it reflects a challenge in development cooperation, actually, which is why
you're talking about there is a group of activist governments, and they are to be found time and time again in these different sectors. Yeah. Andrew, what you?
Yeah, no, I think, my colleague Pauline here was when we did the Swedish case study, it was, in a way, Sweden was a bit the outlier, in the sense that this was, while other countries and the EU was under a lot of pressure to respond to more shorter-term political and security priorities, Sweden was a country which took the original normative agenda as it developed it itself in the 90s, and there were tweaks and there were changes and there were different emphases through different parts of government, but it was remarkably stable. Where I think was quite interesting, and one of the findings that was sort of counterintuitive, was in a way you haven't put the same kind of money and the same kind of growth in money behind this area as the others. So the others have seen a dramatic increase, and you've seen an increase. As Sweden. Now you can quibble on the figures there. And also, Sweden has been pushing at the international level on both the UN and the EU level for a long time. And yet we found at home that there was still some homework to be done. So you talk a good game, and you do some of it, but some of it is and it does relate back to your governance structure, and some of these things are not so easy to fix, and they might be there also for good reason. Where I've found the angst in Sweden, as opposed to the other countries, a lot of the angst was around when you talk to non-governmental actors, in Germany or the EU or in the UK, the non-governmental actors were very critical of the governments, and and you can accept this at face value, or you can be more dissecting of it. In Sweden, there was more concern, both inside and outside government, of who are our friends on these issues now. It seems to be a shrinking number of countries that are seeing the world in the way that we see it. And perhaps some of our friends that, like the UK, they're not going to be in the EU anymore, so that's going to be a loss there. And, Germany seems to be a bit, it's moving as well. And then the EU, yes, it's responding to the migration crisis, and we want that, but not in the way that we would like them to. And on their... They seem to be wanting to use development funds for the kind of things as Sweden, we think, is not what you use development funds for. So that was the sort of the different nuance. And then also the fact that, we say that peace building is in the DNA of Swedish foreign policy. I'm not sure it's quite in the DNA in the same way in the UK. Responding to violent conflict is there, in the DNA of UK foreign policy, but not necessarily the more normative peace-building agenda and approaches. It's more flexible.
Let's pick up on exactly that point, because I think that was one of the issues which you came to in the report. And we'll have a further exchange, and then I'm going to open up for the audience to be asking questions as well about this or other things. But you said it hasn't transformed policy. It hasn't really got itself, peace building that is, it hasn't really got itself to the center of policy. It's not kind of definitive and determining.
Yeah.
It's other factors which do. Okay, hold that thought. Do you, Beverly, first of all, do you agree with that? Is that right? That in some senses you could say peace building is off to one side in the foreign policy, or would you contest that?
I would contest it. I think, as I've said, we see it as quite central to what we do. So within my team, I would say it's as central as, it's part of our central teamwork. We've got lots of staff dedicated to it. We take it quite seriously. We're looking at what our additional offer could be on that. We're taking it to our senior management next week. We're looking at what more programming we can do around it to respond, as I've said, to what the geopolitical influences are at the moment, and how DFID can really step up in this area. So I think it's pretty mainstream for what we do.
I mean, I've often had this feeling that we had in the peace-building field a quite self-contradictory attitude towards profile. Mm-hmm. Because on the one hand, we always wanted more attention to it because we're human and we want more attention to what we're doing and we want other people to take it seriously. And on the other hand, I mean, certainly in the UK, I often felt that as long as number 10 could keep its fingers out, right, as long as it wasn't on the very highest level of the political agenda, then you had a higher chance for actually having an impact. Right? When it got to be such a big problem and it was so high up, the political agendas, then peace building was a pretty small player. Right? So I felt we always had this self-contradictory attitude. I want more attention for peace building and I don't want too much attention for peace building. And I have no idea where the line is to be drawn. But I mean, in Sweden's case, for example, with the UN Security Council, you put conflict prevention, which is, peace building by another name, right at the center of the policy there. That was one of your high priority goals for the UN Security Council membership. And do you feel that has worked?
No, absolutely, I do, and I mean, I think that we did put this already in our candidacy for the Security Council, very high up on our sort of CV. This was an argument for why we felt a good argument that we should be on there, that we could bring this perspective, that we would promise and that we would drive this agenda. I mean, now that we have passed this, I can say that we had some, thinking around some of the gender-related issues. How useful is that on your CV? It might raise objections as well. But we did, and it worked. And I think that our contribution in women, peace, and security, and so on, we feel that has been important, and certainly with a top political engagement in that, in every sense. And that hasn't, I don't think that has been problematic on the sort of civil servant side either. I think that has worked well. You also, I mean, you note in your report that in reality, the engagement on peace building issues, who is involved and not. And I think that in the foreign ministry, there is very close cooperation between the development side and the policy side, and that has long roots and has, it's the same ministry. These things matter as well. It's not only the same building there across the street, but it's the same people. It's the same, that carry both the development agenda and the foreign policy agenda. I mean, the same individuals at times that are responsible for the same thing. You note in your report that engagement is perhaps less prominent in the Ministry of Defense, for example. I think, and you also conclude that this is partly because territorial defense. You have to make your priorities, and that's certainly true. And I would say, from a development perspective, that we have large budgets, that gives opportunities, but it also allows for others to point at you, to say that you have a large budget, so you run with that.
Yeah. And I guess it also allows others to queue up and try and get hold of that large budget. Yeah. Andrew?
Just, just to be a bit provocative on that, my day job is not spent talking about peace building. It's spent talking across foreign ministries about foreign and development policy. That's what I do. That's for the last 10 years, that's what I've done. For me, who came originally from a background of peace building, it is striking how little peace building comes up in the conversations I have across foreign ministries in response to violent conflict. On humanitarianism, on development, on fragile states, those things are, and again you can say, well, you're splitting hairs here, it's rhetorical repackaging, how different should a peace building approach be from those, but there is a small community who uses this language and has this approach. So when you go and talk to conflict advisors or people who are heads of conflict unit, they are fighting their ground inside their ministries and institutions to ensure that perspective is brought to the fore. And they're believers, and they're also experts, and they also have something to say. I think they've come an enormous way in the last 10 years, but I think it would be an oversimplification and also an exaggeration to say that this is what's setting the agenda for foreign and development policy and for responses to violent conflict. I think it's also, again, to go back to Dan, something you said, I think in certain parts of the world it can, because there's less geopolitical competition, there's more space, and people in all the countries and the EU we interviewed was like, well, we can use a peace-building approach if it's Burundi, but Syria right now, we don't even get in the room. As peace builders, as conflict advisors, we're not allowed in that discussion. That's for someone else, or Ukraine. No, that's for some other policy planning unit and intelligence officials and whatever in another part of the building. So the idea of talking local, bottom-up, what are you engaging with civil society, it's an add-on at the end. It's not central. And even we've just finished another piece of work, which will come out next year on Somalia. I mean, Somalia is a textbook case of where you thought peace building and state building should be central. Well, our analysis there is the developmental logic and the humanitarian logic is by far the biggest thing driving the scenario. And the funding streams, the perspectives of those communities to behave in the ways that they have behaved in a long time is very, very strong. And despite 20 years of thinking about trying to engage the government in a more political or governance in a more political way, the incentive structures just aren't really there to have game-changing.
I think that's right. But in the middle of a humanitarian crisis, your first priority is going to be to save lives, and that's what a lot of our teams are doing. But the Secretary-General has said that bringing together development, peace building and humanitarian is his thing. So I do think there are moves afoot. We're never going to change the mandates at the UN, but we are changing the way they work. And it's something that we're all really keen to move across. And as you know, we're also looking at how humanitarian and development work together and how to do that. So DFID has, I hope some of you know, a new building stability framework. And we are asking our offices in fragile states to use that lens for everything they do. And of course, it's going to be a process to get to that point. Interesting conversations with some of our heads of office. But it is something that we are keen that we start to use and that we start to reflect. So in places like Lebanon, we're already seeing a shift in our approach. So this new framework of putting politics first, thinking through every decision, grounding it in the understanding of power distributions, thinking and acting beyond the state. And that's, I think, one of the biggest shifts in this from our previous paper, that we recognise that a lot of these issues are across boundaries and at local community level, whereas prior to that, I think a lot of the thinking was at state level. So thinking beyond the state, looking at it through the whole portfolio, so seeing the whole portfolio through a stability lens is quite important. Being flexible about managing risk and return and building adaptive programming in, so that we can change and adapt our programs as we get feedback on them. A lot of this is not quite new stuff, like migration programming. We don't have that much evidence of what works. A lot of it is on a no regrets basis. Let's see where we get to. We do have a lot of evidence on this, and we are trying to think through how we spend it. And then getting the right people in, getting the right skills, and both Sweden and the UK are looking to get more skills in this and to think about how we can upskill our staff. So it's something we're really keen to do. It's a big shift in our approach, but it is already starting to be visible in some of our country offices. So I hear what you say. But I do also think, we work closely with the Foreign Office, but there might be an occasion where DFID is looking at things through a stability lens, and our ambassador is doing everything he can to try and, prevent conflict. That might not be called peace building, but I should guarantee you that most of what our ambassadors do in these fragile states is in some way personally trying to engage and do what they can. It might just not be called a development kind of peace building,
Yeah, the terminology can be misleading. Let's see if there are questions here. There's one back there right beside you, and that's the more convenient one to start with, and then one here. If you could just say who you are.
Yes, it's
Good to see
again
you.
me.
Yeah.
Malchas Kakabaz, the Georgian Embassy. You have counted a number of conflicts, but you have not mentioned about Georgia. It's a small country. I do not know about your knowledge. And unfortunately, we have two conflicts in this small country. And one of them, it's in Abkhazia. Why I'm mentioning in particular that one? Because since 1993, there was a UN-led peace process, but it was stopped after 15 years. And it went not to zero, but to minus. We lost everything. We lost territories. So how do you see the instruments of peace building? And in particular, probably as I mentioned, it's UN. And my personal opinion, I do not want now to use as my position, but I am former person who's been dealing with conflict for 4 years directly in Georgia. And 4 times I had an opportunity to make a statements on Security Council. And in my last one, in January 2004, I said exactly that same what happened in 2008, but not because that I was saying, but all of our presidents, including even Saakashvili, they were speaking about peace, how to solve it, but nobody paid any attention. So how do you see, is UN body who can solve any conflict in the world?
Andrew, do you want to have a go at that? And then I'll pass it over to Johannes.
I've been in Georgia a few times. I wouldn't claim to be an expert at all on the country and the situation there. And what I do know more is about the EU approach in Georgia. And having been involved in evaluations of the EU's approach to conflict in Georgia. And essentially you had about 4 different approaches going on without different parts of the EU agreeing or talking to each other on what they were trying to achieve there. You have an EU monitor mission, you have an EU special representative, you have an EU delegation, and you have the EU member states. And I think one of the things I would say there is that from an EU perspective, without a collective EU voice, based on a collective analysis and a collective strategy, it's not surprising that the EU was not perhaps a very good actor in terms of supporting peace building in the country. I think there's a lot of politics tied up behind that. I think the EU was actually doing some very good things in funding peace building, community engagement work, including across the administrative boundary line, including some very creative things were being done by conflict officials and taking risks to do work, but the overall geopolitical context and the ability of the UN or the EU to engage with some of those factors was limited. I don't think that makes the peace-building work that was being supported, some of it local level, redundant. I think you have to keep doing that type of work to ensure that if the larger politics move, that you still have the groundswell of activities and engagement to bolster that process when hopefully the politics moves. But yeah, it was not. It's not a particularly good example of either the international community or the UN supporting a peaceful resolution.
Johannes, do you want to take on the larger question of the UN agencies?
If the UN can solve anything?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just that small one.
Well, I mean, what you're fundamentally talking about is a geopolitical conflict or a geopolitical reality in Georgia, which I don't think when we talk about peace building, I would sort of make the same differentiation that you were alluding to. I think that we can and should be engaged on doing that on community level, on national level. But here we have at the core a military-driven conflict that needs to be resolved at a higher level than what we engage in through what we can do in terms of peace building through in the UN system into peace building commission or the agencies basically. But I agree. I don't think that takes away from the importance of continuing to drive that agenda to at least try to contribute to building the fundamentals for when you can resolve the larger conflict occupation. And in that sense, yes, I think that they can contribute. UN, we can, and as members, and UN as such can, of course.
It seems to me that what you're both saying is it's a question of having several different factors moving in the right direction at the same time, so that if the overall political situation is relatively favorable, then the kind of activities that we talk about under the peace building heading can be really positive. If the overall political situation is unfavorable, those peace building activities they can keep a candle going in a dark corner, they can give hope where there's not, they can lay some groundwork, they can lay some foundations, but you're unlikely to see a resolution to the big issue if the overall politics and the peace building efforts are not gelling. That's where we're going with this thought? And that's true if it's the UN.
At least in that kind of situation where,
Okay, so there's one at the back.
Yes, my name is Pelle Enarsson. I'm the head of Department for Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs here at the Ministry. So I work.
Just to interrupt, is that you are also the second 11 to come off the bench in 10 minutes time.
Yes, but I actually had to respond to the question here about Georgia. Andrew, I worked in 2011 to 12 as the desk officer for Georgia in the External Action Service. So I just couldn't sit here and hear your criticism of the EU, because I think I know, and I'm going to answer your question too. But the EU actually, it's not correct what you're describing. I think there was some not close cooperation between the various arms of the EU, but there was coordination between the different actors. And I think what the EU, also with support of its member states, conceived in the case of Georgia was the Eastern Partnership and the agenda of association agreements and trade agreements and visa liberalization. And in a way, if you look at it at a macro level, this is really peace-building stuff. And I was sitting in the negotiations of the association agreement with Georgia, and the conflicts were present throughout those discussions. How do we create the right instruments to actually create possibilities for these breakaway territories to come back into the fold of the Georgian statehood. So definitely that was part of the discussion, and we used the foreign policy instruments of the EU to support dialogue between the parties, etc. So it was actually quite coordinated. I wanted to respond to your question about the UN. I think you made the allegory before about Downing 10 in the UK. Maybe the Security Council is Downing 10 of the world. So when it goes there, then other things come into play. And that's why we need to work much more before that decision comes up to the Security Council, and Johannes mentioned. And I think that was partly the reason why we were so engaged in the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission. That's another type of body. It's the DFID of the UK. It's not the Downing 10.
Okay, so Alex, can you bring forward here?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. Tahir Ismail from Olof Palme International Center. And thank you for the report. Very well done. I find it very interesting. One thing that I find is missing, and probably I guess it is outside of your terms of reference, but I believe that it is very much linked from the tragic terms of reference of people in the field. And that is, we are supporting peace building from those countries, but at the same time selling very much weapon to actors involved in it. I was involved in the last peace talks on Yemen in Kuwait. And sometimes we meet with ambassadors from Great Britain, EU countries, and Germany, and so on. So at the same time, journalists and people, NGOs, asking and telling us, you are sitting with all these people, actors, trying to achieve some kind of peace, stopping war activities, and so on. But at the same time, those countries represented by those ambassadors, they are selling arms all the time. Mm-hmm. So do you think that there is a chance that we overcome this hypocrisy?
Andrew, he said with a big smile on his face. Would you like to?
No, I think that's a fair enough point. And I mean, if you look at the Swedish case study, I mean, we don't shy away from the fact that Sweden is there's an inconsistency there. You know, one of the largest arm manufacturers in the world per capita is Sweden, and yet it is supporting this agenda. So we make that clear. I think also, I mean, the UK in the global war on terror was one of the conflict parties. You know, you can't get away from that. And that is that diminishes what you can do in relation to. It gives you other things you can do in relation to responding to violent conflict and peace building, but as a neutral broker and supporter of peace building, that's a huge limitation. I think and the other point you're making about local actors. I mean, in terms of supporting peace building, local actors are essential components of that peace building process, and they are missing from our report. Why? Because we were trying to look at how things are, not how things should be. And while I would love to have one of the 8 factors that pushes government support to peace building being local actors from conflict areas informing government policy, actually we didn't hear much of that in the end of the day. I think in particular circumstances they have been, but globally overall, in relation to how these policy agendas have been set up, I think there is some justified wishful thinking there, but let's not be, as a policy analyst, I don't see it as strongly as it should be.
Understand the difference between what could and should be and what is. Yeah. Beverly, since the particular case of Yemen was raised, I mean, that's also that's a sore point in relation to Saudi Arabia and arms sales and so on.
Yeah, listen, I mean, DFID does a lot of work through the UN, coming to the earlier point, and strongly, as I've said before, strongly believes in the UN and will support the UN to deliver its mandate on peace building. And sometimes that's really, really difficult because of bigger geopolitical influences and everything. So, but even so, small gains can be made, and we will continue to support that. On some of these conflicts, the UK is making huge investments in supporting some of the economies and in humanitarian response. We do a huge amount of investment in these countries, and we will continue to support the UN and directly support through those. I think your point was interesting on local actors informing policy. It's a good point. It's something we should really bear in mind. It's something that we are increasingly seeing. I mean, you talked about the group of donors. It's the same group of donors on humanitarian. We come together on humanitarian as well, and we are doing a lot of thinking in the humanitarian space about beneficiary feedback and making that not just about someone giving you a form about how you perform, but actually very engaged feedback. So that people can be involved in what we're doing. And I think there's something to be said for this. So it might not be on the policy, but on the programming, very much we would want to engage local actors in our programming. And when we are developing programs, we will consult quite widely on the best ways of doing something. So I do think that we will engage people on programming, and it's something that I think most donors would do. The distinction between policy, that we would have consulted widely on that, but I would like to think that there is quite a lot of engagement with local actors on informing what we do.
Well, I think, of course, we have to admit the whole of government approach and consistency in policies and with conflicting interests and obligations as well. That's true. That's there. You don't shy away from it in your report. I don't think the the government as such does either. We have recently adopted a new law where we try and address these issues on arms sales and the preconditions for that. But it is clearly a very challenging area.
Yeah, There was another question here right in front of you, Alex. Pierre? Yeah.
Thank you. I think we should be happy for all the work you're putting into this peace building in your various, in Sweden, in the UK, and the other countries. And but I also think that the definition you showed here at the beginning about what is how peacekeeping, peace building, is very clear. And I think we all agree upon it, the root causes and the whole, using all the tools in our toolboxes and so on. So actually we don't get much further there. It's instead the changing nature, which you have described, of support, which we must deal with. And we are engaged in questionable interpretations of peace building in Afghanistan, for instance, where you have a lot of military elements, and Yemen, of course, is one of the two countries are involved in a horrific warfare. So I think instead we should use more efforts. We know about peace building, we support it, we want you to continue to develop it where it needs to develop. But we need also to take care into consideration this changing nature, which gives peace building in some places a dirty name by Afghanistan war, for instance. And instead, perhaps we should see, and it has to do a little bit with the UN also, of course, to see where have we had successes. And in fact, we have had in the last decade, this decade, we have had 3 success stories in UN peacekeeping, in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire. And they are still fragile states. They might fall back into warfare again, in civil war. So instead we should be resilient there in our support and go in there and strengthen them and help them and not give up till they can walk along. And there we should put in a lot of our efforts now to develop. And I think countries like the UK and Sweden could join in with other like-minded countries perhaps to focus on such efforts, very specific efforts, and that will also help peace building.
So let me ask you both about that. I mean, we are, very often when we get together in these kinds of gatherings, we like to go for the gloom. Right? We like to go for the sad state of world affairs. International security is deteriorating in front of our eyes. There are the tragedies and the horrors. But there are also the success stories. And I think it's one of the things that has been talked about a lot within what you've called the peace building community, Andrew, is the importance of describing those success stories and explaining them. So are there a couple, Beverly, maybe, that you'd like to pick out and try to start that process, whether they're the ones that Pierre Choury just raised or others?
Yeah, I mean, Sierra Leone, it was amazing what Tony Blair did in Sierra Leone. And I still remember the day I was called in on a Sunday to go to a meeting at the MOD, and I sat around with a bunch of MOD people at the table, and suddenly a big screen appeared with a map of Sierra Leone on it. And then a voice came over the transcript, and someone said, "What time will troops be visible in theatre?" And someone said, "Visible within the hour, sir." And I thought, my God, we're going in. I mean, it was one of those moments of just astonishment. It was a fantastic... I went to Sierra Leone a lot during the Civil War, a huge amount, and I've been a lot since. And I very much agree with you that gaining the peace was the first stage. Keeping the peace is something else. And that transition, I think, when UN peace operations leave in places like Sierra Leone and Liberia is key. But also sustaining it and keeping growth going and stopping lots of young men who don't have jobs from loitering and in Liberia and Sierra Leone and causing problems. There's a big demographic issue, I think, that's a completely separate issue on all of this as well. Young men without jobs is going to be a big issue for us. But I very much agree with you. I think we have made a massive success there. It was a great thing we did. It was really hard and real slog. We were learning as we went along. A lot of those demobilization work and the DDR and the child soldiers and all of that kind of work, it was huge. But we learned a lot. We learned a huge amount doing that. but keeping that going and sustaining it and keeping countries on track and not letting them slip back is a really key part of this.
Can I just interrupt
Yes, sure.
for a second? Because some members of the audience, and maybe even thousands of people watching online, will have been surprised to see the substitution going on. But as I warned you, Johannes had to leave, and we've been joined by Per Enersen, who's head of conflict and humanitarian division in the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and after Beverly has finished her answer, is also going to give a couple of success stories that he likes to think about. So, Beverly, carry on. Sorry I interrupted.
So I do think there's something key there about the gaps, and when you, I mean, it's always the gaps that are the problems. When, as I've said, when peacekeepers move, and then there's something about the longer term multi-year approaches as well. I mean, we right at the beginning gave what was then called budget support to Sierra Leone because there was just no money. I mean, literally nothing you open the safe, there wasn't a penny there. So building the institutions and at that early stage, but then the peace builders need to move on and pass on to the development agencies, and the humanitarian need to move and pass on. So I do think that making those transitions in those kind of countries is also important, and keeping an eye on them and that stability. So, I mean, I agree with you. There's some great successes. And we have managed to maintain them, but we need to keep going.
Hello.
Yeah, I think Pierre, and it's great to have you here, Pierre, because you were also part of the normative preventive work in the UN in the early 2000s. We were sitting down in the basement in the UN, negotiating the resolutions on this. No, but I fully agree, and that's also why we have engaged so deeply into the PBC for Liberia. The Peacebuilding Commission for Liberia. And now we have ended that, but we need to keep up that momentum after the second round of elections, etc. So we really need to not leave too early, and that's a task of us civil servants, really, to convince politicians that this is still an interest, even if it's actually gone away from the headlines. I think Somalia is an interesting example of positive development. That's where we have used normative frameworks to organize our work with the New Deal arrangement. Of course, one of the things that you didn't discuss in the earlier part of the discussion is the influence of other actors. You didn't mention it a lot. Of course, you had the geopolitical element there, but the problem with the multipolar world is that we have very many flows of geopolitical interest, and I think Somalia is one of those places where all those flows come into one place. So it is really hard. So I am actually quite astonished that we're still working with the federal government on a process on having a whole Somalia as a state in the future. It's still going on. It's been slow. It's been not as quick as we wanted in 2012 when we started this work anew. But still, 2012 and not a real relapse with all those interests flowing in. So I think Somalia is a good example where we need to look at the positive part of that.
I think this thing about not leaving too early is really important. You keep going back to the World Bank World Development Report in 2011, and this wonderful factoid, I'm sure it has no basis in absolute empirical research, but it's really a wise and good guidance, and anyway the World Bank said it, so it must be true, is that on average it takes between 15 and 30 years for a country to move from the situation of Haiti to the situation of Ghana. And so 6 years since 2012 is but a blink in that process for a country that Somalia, I think one could say, was in a worse state than Haiti. So that kind of time frame, that kind of chronological framework seems to me to be really important. Andrew, your response to what Pierre was saying.
Yeah, no, I agree on 2 points, and I think in terms of on the successes, I think all success in anything you do in life is time-bound. I mean, I would love to have success in your career, in your managing your finances, your family, but it doesn't work like that. And I think that is one thing that we need to take seriously in relation to peace building. And also, I feel that what's the burden of proof? Peace building has to prove it's successful. Well, there's lots of other policy responses to conflict. How that are military, there are others that also. Are they successful? I think there is also a sort of changing and framing the debate a little bit. around how successful can you, how can you frame success, and are you holding peace building or normative approaches to a much higher standard, and what's the baseline you're working off? And I think that is a debate that needs to get into the political level. It needs to be part of a wider consciousness in society as well. I don't think the development community in any part of the world has really helped that, if I was to be critical, with quite uncomplicated solutions to complex issues. I think there needs to be a much more wider engagement with society and political level and opinion writers on how difficult this stuff is and why it's still worthwhile doing it. On Sierra Leone, I also think that's the positive side. On the negative side, not on Sierra Leone, but on Mali for a long time was, until quite recently, considered a massive success story. And I would say in development success, governance success, including with resources and a key role for one of your Nordic neighbors, that there was also a lack of critical reflection and asking difficult questions at certain moments in that, because people wanted success so badly and are under a lot of pressure for all the other reasons. So I do think there is, yes, we need to be pushing for what success is and to articulate it in a different way, but not to lose the analytical sort of sight to see maybe some of the early signs when things aren't going as well and when things aren't as good as they look. With Sierra Leone, that's also, I went to Sierra Leone evaluating EU conflict prevention and peace building. And again, the message the EU gave to me there was actually quite interesting, that they believed some of the macroeconomic support they were giving to the government was peace building, because it was in the immediate aftermath of the war. It was the same way that budget support in the UK was doing. It was making sure that civil servants were actually paid, and that in their mind, that was peace building at that particular moment in time.
I agree with that. And when I was on the peace building fund, one of the things that we saw in more than one country was peace building fund money being used to keep the electricity switched on.
We call it the peace dividend.
And that is also, that's fundamental to building peace. That I think is part of the issue here, is that there is no one big thing which peace building is. In every place it is made up of a myriad of small activities, some of which are, on the face of it, only indirectly connected with the issue of peace, but nonetheless important for all that. And I think it's become very fashionable to think in terms, people talk about needing to get beyond siloed thinking, but actually we instinctively go for siloed thinking. We instinctively say this is a peace issue, but that's a development issue. Or that's a human rights issue, but this is a something else issue. And very often then we miss the connections. And because we miss the connections between the issues, we miss the chances to do something on one thing that has a positive impact on something else. Is there yes, there is. Another question right there.
But surely there must be a woman.
Well, I've been looking hard, and I can see women, but I haven't been seeing any hands being put up. And there isn't now, so no.
All right, so my name is Henrik Hammergren. I'm the director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. I first want to congratulate Andrew on a remarkable piece of work, and for also organizing the whole process around this. And we sit here with 2 reports, but it's actually 5 altogether. Having followed this for some 25 years, I literally got a bag of money to support small organizations like International Alert and others, and 15 years later got criticized by our development minister for failing to build up a Swedish support to sort of peace-building think tanks and so on, and that could be criticized if you look only at the Swedish report. And there are many things looking back in the Swedish part that it's interesting, it's fascinating to look at this. There's a lot to be learned from this, and perhaps there's a few missing pieces in this story about how it actually, it wasn't only sort of a hunky-dory story, it was rather an uphill push. And it took quite a lot to get where Sweden is today and join up the dots. Things didn't really change until sort of more resources were added, and Folke Bernadotte Academy was established, and that's in 2002. It takes 10 additional years before that cooperation really starts to lead somewhere at country level. and so on. And one can go into the details of this. And it's also interesting to see how the focus that made that change was really the push for DDR and SSR and so on. I could rave on that, but I think it's more important to look forward. And yes, we know if we look back that it was under-prioritized. It isn't anymore. It was under-resourced. We can't say it is anymore. Yes, the Peace Building Fund is not getting the quantum leap yet. Hopefully it will. But we have the sort of IDA replenishment that completely changed the landscape of financing. And it was undefined in a way, and it continues to be, and it's actually been added. Peace building has been added with sustaining peace, not really adding to the clarity. But when you bring this out at country level, that's not a problem. It's actually an advantage if you talk to people in the regions and in countries that you can then apply various frameworks and adopt them to country sort of to the country's situations and be more specific. But my point in this is really that, and it builds on what's been said on humanitarian issues and also what you just said, Dan, and it's about the fragmentation that continues to be a huge problem for this whole field. And why is it? And why is it that we can be successful in some of these areas, but when it comes to addressing the really difficult issues around the rule of law, around the legitimacy of politics, falling back on what should be the normative driver of change, and that whole indicator as well, or part in your diagram on the normative frameworks, international commitments and norm, that continues to be a challenge. Perle referred to the New Deal and so on. We have the SDG 16, but the true commitments to this and the joined-up approaches are still missing.
Yeah. Okay, so we're coming towards the end, so I'm going to ask each of you to reply, making this your last comment. So you've got to pick up any loose ends along the way that you feel. But it seems to me that the question is twofold. It's one, it's about the fragmentation, the non-joining up of different issues. And the other is about the journey and the rocky road, to some degree, to get from, let's say, where we were at the end of the Cold War, when new opportunities started to open up for what the UN could do, for what donor agencies could do, and for what NGOs and others could do. And we saw for 2 decades a significant expansion of the zone of peace worldwide, armed conflicts coming to an end and issues being resolved and so on. Just to reflect a little bit on that road and where you think it's going. But relatively freehand, couple of minutes each, and then we're done. But yes, just come along this way. Start with you, Pelle.
Okay, I think I would like to address this issue about the fragmentation of the system. We are in a period when many organizations are in some kind of adaptation mode. The World Bank has got its resources financially, but the organization is not yet penetrated with the norms that are needed. So I would say the World Bank will have an issue spending the money. And now they're right in the middle of a midterm review. So I think that will come up, which hopefully will lead to some re-resourcing of the implementation power for that money. The UN is in the middle of a huge internal reform process, which has become hijacked by political motives, and we'll see where that goes. It's in the middle of that. Hopefully, they will land on their feet sometime after Christmas or a couple of months later, and then they will have to roll out this new representation in the field. But that also gives an opportunity, as I see it. We have work on the humanitarian side. If you look at the UN, the Global Central Emergency Response Fund, we are working on the PBF. There could be synergies between these two financial instruments for the UN to put the glue together at the country level for the UN system to be more coherent. So I see opportunities with these movements, and some of the bilateral actors are in the middle of that process. I would argue that we are still really in the starting blocks. We have just come out of the starting blocks. As Henrik said, the Folke Bernadotte Academy is right now becoming more operational in the field. This is it's a slow rollout, and I think we are working to boost the capacity. So I'm actually quite I'm hopeful that we will achieve. But we also, when it comes to our own, we talked about the long process of peace building. Well, it takes a long time to adapt organizations too. And we are in the middle of that. And I really think that we will be in a better place in many years. And of course, the normative work on the Agenda 2030 guides this. It drives it as well. We have the follow-up next summer on SDG 16.
Beverly?
I don't need that, do I? Thank you very much. A few points. Thank you for mentioning the bank money. I had a note to myself to mention it, and I didn't. We did a huge amount of work in trying to get resources in the bank towards fragile states. We saw there was a gap in resourcing, and the big money was at the bank. So we've done a lot of work on that. Perhaps your next piece of work can be on, the bank in fragile states. What we as donors haven't quite got to, having influenced the bank on this, is where we go next in that. And I think it's the next step for us to, and I've been talking to the team back in London about this, about how we now talk to the bank about this work and encourage it and think through what that means, because it is a lot of money and the bank haven't done this before and it's new areas for them. But it is money and it's where it's needed, so that's great and we're really pleased about that. Just to endorse what everyone else has said, it is a really bumpy road, this kind of work, and they are setbacks, and even the most pessimistic scenarios give very good rates of return on it, so it's really worth doing, and we all think it's worth doing. But as we've said, a lot of people involved in this do it under different labels and different names, and I think our Foreign Office would probably call it something else, but continue doing it. So I do think there's a lot. On the fragmentation, we don't see that in DFID as much because because the way we are structured, all our teams work together on this, so we don't see that fragmentation as much. But I am aware that it's an area we as donors need to come together more on and do some joint programming and joint thinking around a portfolio of work that we can make sure we complement each other on. So that's something that we will take forward, and we'll work better together on that in the future, hopefully.
And so I think she just offered you a grant from DFID for you. So we're ending the meeting in a very hopeful way.
It's interesting you say the bank. I was in Washington for the first time in 15 years last week, doing this report, 2 weeks ago doing this report. The previous 15 years, I'd almost been manhandled out of the World Bank for talking about conflict sensitivity and the importance of thinking about conflict. I mean, literally, I had senior people, well, not actually, they weren't very senior, they couldn't see the senior people, but people in the bank saying, this is political, this is not our mandate, who do you think you are coming in here telling us what to do with your tools for conflict analysis? This is completely beyond what we would like to do. 15 years later, the session before I was speaking, there was someone from the World Bank talking about the importance of conflict sensitivity, how they were doing it, and so I was like, wow, that's 15 years. Things have really come from the margins to the mainstream. So that's, on one level, I'm quite positive that, that on the technical expert level, the knowledge and expertise is there, and the bumpy road that many people have bear the scars from, Henrik, look at you, to push this agenda for the last 20 years against an uphill battle. The technical side is there, and it is, and the normative frameworks are there. My concern is the politics, globally, European, national, are not pointing in the right direction in terms of following through on those and getting the type of political sponsorship that will be required to be sustained over the longer run, because as we all acknowledge, it takes a long run to see the results to drive this agenda. So my point at this meeting in DC was to say there needs to be a greater domestic political constituency for these kind of issues, because with the political constituency demanding them will come a greater level of political support and tolerance for the rocky road, the risk-taking, and the support that this is an agenda worth supporting and engaging in. In Sweden, I think it's a slightly different perspective than other countries because it's there, but again, Swedish politics, as we all know, is changing at the moment. In other countries, if supporting peacebuilding can be part of a new vision for Britain engaging in the world after Brexit, I think that would be great. I think the EU also has a big thing coming up about where it's going in the future. If peacebuilding can be incognated into that, as this is what it means to be European and to part of the political culture, I think we will get far. I think if it is just an expert discussion, without wider political support and high-level support, I think we are going to be stuck in fragmentation and worse for a long time.
But if we can take it out, if it can go beyond being an expert discussion, then the prospects are not so bad.
Not so bad.
Even good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's end on that note. Thank you very much to the panelists.
Thank you.